Alrighty, well, good afternoon and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for today's author talk. My name is Andrew Doffney. I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at the New Jersey State Library, and it is my great pleasure to present our speaker for today, Douglas McVarish, who is going to be talking to us today about researching your house history here in New Jersey. We at the library here often get questions, genealogy and research questions that sometimes tie into a house history, and it's great that we have somebody here that can speak to this, who has gone through this process multiple times and who is pretty much an expert on this. So welcome, Douglas. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to our patrons today.
Thank you.
Douglas is a semi-retired architectural historian and in historic preservation. He holds graduate degrees from the University of Virginia and the University of Vermont, and has 30 years of professional experience as an architectural historian in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. He worked for 5 years as a National Register for Historic Places Reviewer for the State Historic Preservation Office, and most recently spent a year working on a special project under contract to the National Park Service's National Register Office. So, and as I mentioned before, this is an author talk. He has published a book on researching your house history in New Jersey, which is going to be the topic of today. Before we jump into Douglas's presentation, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. First and foremost, we will be addressing your questions at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to submit them at any time using the Q&A or the chat features in the Zoom dashboard. Douglas has provided me with 2 handouts that I will be uploading to the chat once we get underway so that you can download them there. If you have trouble downloading the handouts from the chat, don't worry, they will be available in the follow-up email as well. At the end of the program, there will be a survey available for you. If you have time, we ask that you please complete the survey. We're always appreciative of any feedback that you can provide us. And if you want more information on historical house research, the Historic Preservation Office has a guide at the web address on the screen there. It's a digitized version of it that we have done here at the library, and I will copy that link and send it out in the chat to make sure that everybody has a live link to it. All right. One last thing before we jump into the presentation. This is what your dashboard should look like if you're using a PC or a Mac. If you're using a mobile device, the dashboard may look a little bit different, but all of the features will still be there. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see your audio settings. So if you're using an external listening device, such as headset or earbuds, you can check to make sure that they're connected properly there. At any point during the presentation, if you have any issues, there is a raise hand button here in the middle. You can click on that. That'll alert me, and I will send you a message in Zoom and hopefully be able to resolve any problems that you are having. And lastly, as I mentioned, if you do have any questions, you can submit them at any time using the chat button or the Q&A button, and we'll be happy to address them. So that is everything that I have. So I'm going to turn it over to Douglas now and get his presentation up.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you all for attending, and thank you for the library for sponsoring my talk. The way this book came about was that I have been working as a volunteer at a local historical society for quite a while, and every once in a while somebody will come in and look for information about house histories, how to do a house history, and I just found that it was a need that was not really being met. And because resources and means to access them vary by state, I decided to do one specifically on New Jersey. It's not my native state, but I've lived here for over 30 years, and I've done a fair amount of research on buildings in New Jersey. And in this book, I lay out a sequential process for doing a house history, and we'll briefly go through the steps in this webinar. There are a lot of similarities between house history research and genealogy. There are some who pursue genealogy to find all the begats, who gave birth to who married who, and that is the approach that some people take as far as what they write. They just basically write the begats. In the same way, a house history can be just basically a chain of title, who had it, who bought it when, and who sold it when, and so forth. But in my view, a house history should be more than that. And to give you a bit of the flavor of the approach, one of the handouts that will be available in the chat is a paper that I actually co-wrote about 50 years ago. in my first year of college with my classmate Heather Menninger. It was the first time that I had done property history research at that point. And the part that I would like you to look at specifically is concerning, is probably the part that was written by Heather, in which she brought not only brought the people into the period when this actual archaeological site, there was a house there or nearby, and there were some buildings there, bring people into the history of the community and that they lived in at that point. And I think that's what makes a house history a house history. Next slide, please. This has all been compiled in the information I'm giving you has all been compiled in a book that's available from Amazon. You don't have to take notes. One of the other handouts is my brief notes about my presentation. And so I think I hope you'll just be able to listen and enjoy the presentation. Next slide, please. Next slide. What is a house history? A house history includes when was it built, how has the house and surrounding property changed over time, what are the social, economic, and demographic characteristics of the surrounding neighborhood. This is assuming that the house is in a city or a community. If not, if it's in a rural area, say in rural Sussex or Warren County, you might look at what the surrounding farms have been used for and how that has changed over time. Who has lived in the house? What roles do they play in their community of residents? Next slide, please. In the book and in this presentation, I go into a number of sources of information. The first one is personal observation and follow-up research. If it's your own house, you obviously have access to the exterior and interior of the house, the entire property, etc. If you're doing a house history on a prominent property in town, you may not have that access. But the first step is looking at the house and seeing what you can tell by just looking at it. Second step that I suggest is going to the internet. Although some people think that everything is on the internet, as I'm sure most of us know, not everything is on the internet, which leads to having to go to historical societies, libraries, and archives. Beyond that, state agencies, the state library, which has a wonderful collection for house history research, the state archives and the state historic preservation office, and finally, county and municipal records. Next slide, please. Next slide. As I say, a majority of houses do not have an architectural style, but if they do, it, along with an architectural style guide, will provide valuable clues as to when the house was built. Next slide. This is a house with a style. Actually, one could argue that it has two styles. I would call it a Queen Anne shingle style house. But basically those two styles together probably give it a date of the early 20th century. Next slide. On the other hand, this house, I don't know what you would call it. It may have been just built by a builder who just wanted a functional house for a family or for probably a small family, considering how large the house is. Next slide, please. In addition to looking at the style of the house, you should also look at what changes have been made to the house and what you can see as a layperson about the changes. This is probably one of the most changed houses in New Jersey. It is a White Hill Mansion in Fieldsboro, Burlington County. You can see on the right, there is a brick part. Actually, the brick part goes the entire length, but it's only partially visible. You can see that there's a series of additions, probably at different times. There's a gambrel roof addition, there's a flat roof porch, there's a oriel window, there's all sorts of other things. So by your house is probably not that complicated, but by listing all the changes that have been made and just getting some ideas about when they might have been made, you can get a good start to your house history. Next slide. If your house is a particular style, or if you think it may be a particular style, as I say, the definitive guide to American house styles is Virginia Savage McAllister's Field Guide to American Houses Revised Edition. The library has it in its browsing collection. Most other public libraries have it. It's also in print on at least from Amazon, the soft cover is relatively affordable. The hardcover is not. But if you want the hardcover edition, you can probably go to someplace like Better World Books and get it at a fairly reasonable price. Next slide. Next slide. Internet sources. The first internet source that I'm going to cite is the state GIS database. The reason why I'm citing that is if it's your own house, you presumably know its address, you know who you bought it from. You may even know the tax lot and parcel number from your property tax invoices that you get. But if it's another house in your town which you're researching, you may not know this information, and I'll tell you in a moment how you can get that information. Other sources include maps. There are a lot of them online, especially from the Library of Congress and the New York Public Library, as well as some New Jersey sites that I go into in the book. Newspapers. A lot of the newspapers have been digitized. There are several large commercial digitization projects, probably the largest one being newspapers.com, which is done by ancestry.com. But those are daily newspapers, the ones that people used to pick up on coming back from work or going to work. But there are also trade newspapers. There are two. There's one that was issued out of New York. There's another one that was issued out of Philadelphia. One in Philadelphia basically covers southern and central New Jersey. The one in New York covers northern and central New Jersey as well. These trade newspapers, which were called, go blank at this point. But anyway, I will tell you when we get to them. Basically, what they had were listings. They were designed for contractors and people like plumbers and electricians and so forth to find possible jobs. Other internet sources include deeds. Not all deeds are online. You'll probably eventually have to go to a county clerk's office. Probate records, an awful lot of those are available on a wonderful site called FamilySearch.org, which is done by the Mormons. They were the ones who originally microfilmed all these records, and they have them on their website. Some images and some city directories are available online as well. Next slide. The GIS databases. This New Jersey map is available from Rowan University, and I have the link to it in the handout. Next slide. What it will give you, among other things, is the deed book reference. If it generally gives you the deed book reference, but the deed book reference is contingent upon it being part of the digitized records of the particular county. For instance, my wife and I bought our house a little bit over 30 years ago, and Camden County had not digitized their records back that far. So the deed book and page number of our acquisition would not be listed there. The other piece of information in the upper circle is the year the house was built. I would take that with a very big grain of salt. To give an example from another state, a while ago I was doing some research for my consulting role for a county in Pennsylvania. A lot of the houses that we looked at were old, and all of the houses that were old were given the date of 1902. Why it was given 1902, I have no idea. There was not a huge population boom in 1902. 1902 was apparently the date that they used for old, and we don't know how old. Some of the other dates may have come from either the assessors just saying, well, it looks like 100 years old to me, or talking to the property owner who may or may not know. But on the other hand, sometimes the dates are exact. So you just have to write down the date, but be prepared to confirm it from another source. Next slide, please.
Douglas, you've had a couple people already ask what GIS stands for, so can you just let them know?
Okay, GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems. Yeah, and GIS is what Geographic Information Systems is a database that links maps to other information. So for instance, if you want to find your property that's like 100 Main Street in Newton, New Jersey, you just type in 100 Main Street and it will show you the parcel where the property is on, and you can find out more information about that property. Okay, next slide, please. The first place that I suggest that you start looking are maps. For one thing, they're interesting. An interesting view of the past. Most of the maps that you will start with were issued in the late 19th century, some in the early 20th century. If you're on the internet, most of them were in the late 19th century and are available primarily from the Library of Congress. But if you're in South Jersey, my wonderful dear departed friend, Peter Hamilton, put together this great website called westjerseyhistory.org, and that they have a lot. He came up with copies of a lot of these. So if you're in South Jersey, I would strongly urge you to use that website. What these maps and atlases will show you, they're called cadastral maps. Cadastral meaning that the property owners' names are indicated and listed. This, for instance, this example is from Marlton Evesham Township, Burlington County. For instance, you can see Mark Lippincott owning a property on the west side of a road. The 73 indicates that the property was 73 acres in size. That can come out in very handy when you're doing a chain of title research later in the process. Next slide, please. Another useful type of map is the insurance atlas. So a lot of you are probably familiar with the Sanborn fire insurance maps. You may not be familiar with the Scarlet fire insurance maps, which cover part of New Jersey. Both of these maps and other maps are available online at the New Jersey State Library in a fire insurance database that can be accessed from the library. The fire insurance maps are useful for a couple of reasons. One, if a property is in a city situation like this one is, the surrounding businesses and industry might give you an idea of where the people who lived in your house may have worked. Also, they're issued every couple of years, generally for most cities or towns. I should say that they are available only for cities, towns, and suburbs. They aren't available for the rural sections of the state. Since they were issued every couple of years, you can tell whether the house has whether an addition has been put onto the house, whether an outbuilding has been built or taken down, that sort of thing. So they can be very useful. Next slide, please. Another source of information are subdivision plats. I believe only 2 counties have some of their subdivision plats online. Monmouth County has all of them online. I think Cape May County has some of them online. 1 or 2 other counties may have some of them online as well. What subdivision plats are is when a developer came in wanting to build houses or sell houses to people to build, they were required in a county to lay out the dimensions of the lots and dimensions of the streets that were being built as a part of subdivision plats. I should caution you a little bit. For instance, this one was filed in 1891, and given it Spring Lake, and given Spring Lake is a rather Victorian community, I have a feeling it was probably developed shortly thereafter. But some subdivision plats, there was one subdivision, for instance, in my hometown of Collingswood in Camden County, which they laid out in about 1924, and it didn't get it completely built out until the 1950s. And then there are also other subdivisions that or just sort of a dream in the eye of the person who filed the plat, and they were never developed. Next slide, please. One of the map types that I really enjoy looking at, and are actually quite useful to the house, can be quite useful to the house historian, or bird's eye views. This is one of quite a number of bird's eye views that are available from the Library of Congress for download. Bird's eye views are basically, I mean, I have a drone picture in back of me. They're sort of the earlier version of a drone picture. Bird's eye views were basically compiled from the ground level, but because they were compiled from the ground level, especially the houses in the foreground, are generally pretty good representations of what the houses actually looked like at the time that the bird's eye view was prepared. And as you can see down below, there are also views of particular individual buildings in the community. So a lot of house history is a game of luck and just good fortune. And if your house happens to be one of the ones that's pictured down below, you're really in luck. Next slide, please. Newspapers, next slide. Yeah, newspapers, general circulation newspapers are useful for a couple purposes. First of all, on the left is just sort of a symbolic image of an advertisement for a subdivision. A lot of in the New York City metropolitan area and the Philadelphia Camden metropolitan area, there are a lot of communities that were developed around railroads or trolleys or something like that. And usually to get people, especially to get people to come out from the cities, developers often really talked about what sort of a bucolic atmosphere it would be in their subdivision and so forth. And they often had a whole series of advertisements chronicling the wonderful life in their subdivision. And those can be quite useful in sort of characterizing where your house is located. In the upper left, on the upper right is a sheriff's deed mention. Sheriff's deeds come from basically misfortune. Generally, a sheriff's deed was filed either in recent years, when you failed to pay property taxes or public utilities, or in previous years, sometimes it was that, or sometimes it was that you got a mortgage from someone and you never paid the money back. Sheriff deeds very widely in the amount of information that they contain. Some sheriff deeds, especially the earlier ones, have a wealth of information about what was on the property, because they're trying to share a sale advertisement, because they want to try to sell the property. The person who holds the lien wants the property sold, obviously. Down in the lower right, far more common than the display ads were individual ads for properties in suburban areas. Philadelphia papers generally had those in Camden County and Burlington County and Gloucester County at least. And the New York papers probably had those in at least Bergen and Essex and Hudson counties, et cetera. But one thing that I should tell you is a lot of them have advertisement for houses, but they don't generally give the address of the house, which is the same reason why most advertisements for apartments these days don't give the address of the apartments. They don't want people coming unannounced. So they more often give the address of either the developer or the realtor. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there are trade newspapers. Yeah, again, the name still goes out of my mind, but I believe it's listed in my handout. There are two, as mentioned, there are two. The one in the lower right is from the New York Builder's Guide. And what Builder's Guides tell you is generally who the architect was, the size of the building, the materials of the building, and also the name of the person who it was being built for. as with advertisements, they generally don't tell you the specific street address, but by using city directories and other means, you can generally find out where, for instance, with a house in Flemington, New Jersey, where Frankie Green of Flemington was living at about that time, and by that means get the connection to your house. These builders guides, the builders guides were basically limited to mostly to architecturally designed houses. So if your house is not architecturally designed, it may not be listed there. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, historical societies and libraries. One thing that I should say about historical societies and libraries is that a lot of them rely very heavily on contributions from people. So if people have not contributed the information, they may not have it. But as far as secondary sources at historical societies, that's probably where I would suggest that you start. In the left-hand side is a history of Morris County. It's actually a fairly recent history of Morris County as those things go. Probably more valuable are county histories from the 19th century. The reason why they're more valuable is because in a lot of cases they were paid for by subscription, and they are divided into municipalities. And after the history of the municipalities, there are often portraits written and graphic portraits of people, and occasionally, such as in the early one in Morris County, there are pictures, there are drawings of some of the properties in the community. The way that you got either your picture or your house picture in the history was basically by giving money for the publication of the book. So it is not representative, but again, if you happen to come across one that has the people who lived in your house or the house, you're in luck. In the center, this is one of the more contemporary houses, more contemporary local histories. There aren't that many, but this is an excellent one done by a distinguished retired professor at Rutgers University, Camden, Fort Camden. And then on the right, historic site surveys. Historic site surveys, they vary in detail, they vary in date as well. Some historic site surveys have been done fairly recently, or actually some have been done as recently as last year, because if a community is a certified local government, which I don't have time to go into now, but if anybody wants to know about it, I can answer it in the questions. Certified local governments have the ability to get grants from the state for projects, including survey. So some of those communities have been surveyed or resurveyed in recent years, but some communities have only, the most recent survey is from the 70s, which of course means that it's 50 years old. So a house that you might consider old, they might not have considered old in 1970, so it may not be in there. Next slide. Another source of information that's available at most libraries and historical societies are city directories. City directories are sort of like phone books, only in addition to the phone number, they also generally list the occupation and sometimes the employer of the people who lived at a particular address. Earlier city directories are difficult to use because they don't have any way of looking up the address. However, from the 1930s, most directories have what is called a crisscross index. An example is shown on the right. Basically, what a crisscross does is just list all the streets in the municipality, all the numbers on all the streets in the municipality, and the occupants of those particular addresses. One thing that makes it particularly good is not only did they list the owner of the property, they also list tenants or other people living at the property, servants or whatever. Next slide. These insurance contracts and building contracts or insurance records and building contracts are not available at every library or historical society. In fact, they're available at fairly few, but if they are, they can be a very valuable source of information. The one on the left is from the Rowan collection at the Historical Society of Haddonfield. Rowan was an insurance, I guess, appraiser, you might call him. He went around working for various insurance companies, property insurance companies, and would go to like a farm property and, just basically come up with an inventory of what was there so that they knew what they were insuring. It would include the style, the materials of construction, the size, the use of the building, and often the construction date. On the right is a building contract. Building contracts were filed with particular counties, but most of them are no longer with the county, but have been, some of them are, for instance, in Monmouth County, they're now at the county archives, which is at the Manalapan Library. And what building contracts show basically say is they're sort of, they give all the information about the construction of a building. And in some cases, they also include architectural drawings of the building, though rarely. Which brings me to another, next slide, please. Next slide, okay. Yeah, with the mention of architectural drawings brings me to another subject. People are always wanting to know whether there are architectural drawings of their house. Chances are very, very slim, except if you live in one or two communities. There are a couple of communities that are indicated in the book that have large collections of drawings of local buildings. They were collected. I'm not sure actually how they were collected. They may have been donated by the architects themselves. Collingswood has maybe 10 architectural drawings that were donated by someone, and they're in the library. But although they will probably not be there, it would probably be useful when you go to a library local history collection or a historical society, just to ask them whether they have any architectural drawings of buildings in their community. Photos and postcards. Most of the time, unless your house is a landmark in the community, it will not be individually shown on a photo or a postcard. And for instance, the one in the lower right, which used to stand in Collingswood but no longer does, was the landmark at that point. More likely is what is seen on the other photo, a streetscape. Streetscapes are more common because if someone was putting together a postcard, if they did a streetscape, then they could try to sell it to everybody on the street to send to their friends and neighbors or whatever. So if your house happened to be in the foreground, you could find a fair amount of information about it. If it happened to be in the background, it doesn't help you too much. Next slide. Municipal and county records, deeds. Yeah, this is what people generally think of when they're doing a house history is, yeah, I want to trace the deeds back. And in almost all counties, the most recent deeds are available online. And the oldest deeds are also available online. The oldest deeds being those going back to the formation of the county to about 1910. But as I indicate, deeds tell you who owns the land, generally not whether there's a house on the land, or if a building is mentioned, whether it is the current building. And these can be, I should tell you, you can sometimes get back to the 18th century if your house is that old by you looking at deeds. The chances of you getting that back that far without running into a roadblock are pretty slim. I mean, I've probably done about 500 chain of titles, and I would say probably 495 I've run into some roadblock during the course of my research. Next slide, please. This is just an extract of a deed from Salem County from 1784. Salem County is one of the counties that has the oldest deeds in its collection. Actually, they have a small archive in their county office building. Next slide, please. Plat maps, which I mentioned earlier, plat maps are filed in the county clerk's office. They are organized in various ways. If you're looking at if you want to look for a plat map, I would suggest that you talk to county clerk staff and have them help you figure out where and how to get access to it. Sometimes in some places you have to look at it rolled up maps and just sort of hunt and peck, see if you can find them. Next slide, please. Other county clerk's office records. In addition to plat maps and deeds, other records include road returns. Road returns were when in the earlier history of the county, when roads were laid out, that a surveyor laid them out, but that viewers from the local community were appointed to make sure that the roads were laid out, were actually built the way they were supposed to be laid out. And road returns, some of them are quite useful because sometimes they say the road goes west of the farm of such so and so, or in some other cases, they will be shown on the next slide. With they also have drawings of actual houses and the indications of who own them. Manumission applications. Hard to believe that New Jersey was once a slave state, but it was. And manumission applications can be useful in fleshing out the history of the people who lived in a house, in an antebellum house. Tavern license applications, they may not seem very relevant, except that tavern license applications, in order to get a tavern license in the early days, you had to get the signatures of all the surrounding property owners. So looking at the signatures, you might be able to figure out who was living in the house at that time. Land division records, basically, often because of wills and other instances, land was divided, and there are records of that. And records of legal actions. Those will mostly be useful for sort of fleshing out the portraits of the people who lived in the houses. Next slide, please. As indicated, this is a road return from Burlington County, and you can see at on either side of the T intersection, there are indications of houses, and it indicates who lived there, so that you know who lived there at the time of the road return. Next slide. Surrogate's office records. In some cases, the surrogate's office will be down the hall from the county clerks. In some other cases, it will be in a different building. One thing that I should tell you about surrogate's office is they generally like you to not only have the name of the deceased, but also a very, very good idea about when the deceased died. It makes searching records an awful lot easier. But one thing I would also suggest that you start with familysearch.org, because you can get most of the stuff without actually going to the surrogate's office. Surrogate's offices have wills. Of course, one is familiar with wills. Orphan court proceedings. Orphan court proceedings took place when a person did not have a will, so the property had to be passed on through the orphan court proceedings. Inventories can be incredibly useful, or they can be not very useful. I'll go into that in a moment. And then divisions of estates. In some cases, there were maps showing how the estate was divided. Next slide. This is just an example of a will. Yeah, it's not very readable, so let's go on to the next slide. This is an example of an inventory. This was an inventory for a farm property. And basically it includes typical farm materials such as troughs and props and shovels and hoes and all that sort of thing. The most useful inventories, you don't find them very often, but if you do, it's a gold mine, are ones in which the person who was doing the inventory went through a house room by room not only told what was in each room, but told the name of the room, etc. So you can almost picture exactly what the house looked like at that point in time. If you come across that, it's very lucky and it's very fortunate. Next slide. Municipal records. State record retention schedules do not require that most municipal records be permanently retained for whatever reason. There are two major sources of municipal records that are useful to the house historian. One are assessment records, basically tax record cards. Tax record cards are no longer used because they're basically all on computer now. But in the times from, I guess, like the 30s to about the 60s, towns would, during reassessments, would fill out these their assessors would fill out these tax record cards, usually take a photograph of the building and tell all about its construction, sizes of rooms, material roof, etc. They can be useful for having a picture of your house, the house that you're looking at a particular time. They're not available for all towns. I don't know. They're probably not available for most towns, but for instance, Trenton has its tax record cards available in the Trentoniana collection of the Trenton Public Library. Other places like Cannon Heights and Camden County has it in its local history collection. The other records that are useful are building permit files. I think the historic building permit files that exist are all still in the building permit office of the particular municipality. I think for privacy concerns, among other things, they haven't bequeathed them to local historical societies or local libraries. So when you get to that point, I would go to the building inspector's office in the local municipality and just ask them how old, what is their oldest building permit files, and could you have access to them? Next slide, please. Then we get to state repositories. First one being the state library. Not only because they're sponsoring this talk, but also because they are an excellent source of information for the house historian. Among other things, they have in-library public access to ancestry.com, and as mentioned, the database of fire insurance maps. They have an extensive local history collection, most published histories. Some of the materials that have been donated to the library are unpublished and are available a few other places. A postcard collection, some of which is online, but not all. One thing that not many people know about is their clipping files. The clipping files, Andrew will probably be able to say more directly to this, but they go from about the 50s to the 1980s and are indexed by subject. To get access to the clipping files, you have to talk to one of their very nice reference librarians. Extensive genealogical collections. Again, they have genealogies. They also have periodicals on family periodicals and other materials as well. They have the largest collection of historical maps and atlases in the state. And they have both microfilmed and hard copies of city directories. And one thing that is also has been very useful for me in the past, and would be useful to a house historian, are microfilm copies of 19th century manuscript censuses of agriculture and manufacture. If your property was at any point a farm, especially in the 19th century was a farm, there are agricultural censuses done every 10 years from 1850 to 1880. These agricultural censuses will tell you exactly what they grew on the farm, what livestock they had, etc. Or if the person who owned your house or lived in your house was a manufacturer of small tradesmen or whatever who may have made shoes or made iron goods or whatever, they will, or was a miller, for instance, they will have records of that in census of manufacturers. This is the only collection that I know of in the state, as far as I know, that has microfilms of the manuscript censuses of manufacturers and and agriculture. I could also mention the census of population, but given the time, I will prefer doing that. Next slide, please. The New Jersey State Archives. I start off with the extensive records of the proprietaries of East and West Jersey. Both the proprietaries of East and West Jersey, which surprisingly still exist, have basically put their records on permanent loan or loan to the state archives. The state these records include basically property records from the settlement of New Jersey through the formation of individual counties. Some of them go beyond the formation of individual counties, and are great if you get back that far, which can be a challenge. You can research further back using the records of the proprietaries of East and West Jersey. They are digitized. A lot of the records have been indexed and are available on the website. You can at least get a start there to look at the individual deeds or surveys for most of the properties you need to go to the state archives. Another, I mentioned earlier, road returns. You might look at a road return for a particular road and say, where is that? I don't know I don't know what that relates to. A person in the 1930s, I believe, realized that question would be asked. So he or she went through the entire state with state collection of topographic maps and marked the location of each road return that was filed on the map. At least not actually, probably not every road return, but the earlier road returns. So you can figure out exactly where a road return refers to by looking at those maps. They have a large collection of microfilm runs of newspapers from throughout the state. I should say that they are not indexed, so you'll have to use other search strategies. And they also include county records, including deeds, probate records, road returns, and assessment books. Most of them are microfilms. A few of them are available in hard copy. Next slide, please. The New Jersey Historic Preservation Office, where I used to work. The New Jersey Historic Preservation Office is not open for in-person research at this point. The staff of the Historic Preservation Office, however, is very, very accessible. You just call them up and the administrative assistant will direct you to a person who can handle your query. Before I would contact the Historic Preservation Office, I would suggest that you look at Lucy, which is the office GIS database, which is available through the New Jersey Historic Preservation Office website, to check to see whether the property has been previously surveyed and or listed or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. When you have that information, I would give it to the staff member who you talk to. That will help them do their research for you. National Register files can sometimes have a lot of information, and some other files have been prepared for other properties which may not be listed in the National or New Jersey registers, but may have been the subject of a state or federal action. Next slide, please. And after you've done all this research, I hope you'll put it all together and write it down in house history. And as I say, the house has, well, actually it has a story. And mentioned, consider the house in the context of the neighborhood and community, and place people in their lives in the house. And that is one of the handouts that's available, sort of does that for a community, for a place in South Amherst, Massachusetts. Changes to the house is reflective of the lives and needs of its occupants. And when you've finished the house history, consider providing a copy of your finished history to your community's library, the Historical Society, and or the State Library. And next and last slide. Yes. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions beyond the time that we have available. That my email address is there, and I would welcome the chance to correspond with any of you. Thank you very much for listening. And if I'll address any questions that might have come up in the chat.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Douglas, for a very informative presentation. If anybody does have questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A or the chat, and then we'll be happy to address them. So let's see here. When a historic survey is done by the state, how do you track that down to get a copy? Where are they stored, and do you need to file a request?
Okay, a historic survey. Well, if it's a municipal historic survey done as a planning survey, it's generally available in either the county or local library. But if it's a historic survey that is done, for instance, because of regulatory action, for instance, a state wetlands permit is needed or something like that, or some sort of federal permit is needed, the survey is available at the state historic preservation office collection. In order to track it down, what you have to do on the State Historic Preservation Office website, there is a list of reports by county and municipality. If you can find something that looks logical, you can make a request I'm not sure if the form is on the website or not, but you can call the State Historic Preservation Office if it is not. You have to submit a specific request, and a lot of the reports have been digitized already. And if they've been digitized already, after you submit a request, you will get a digital file. If it hasn't been digitized, it will just take a little while. Justina, who works in the Historic Preservation Office, will probably digitize it for you, and it will be sent to you. There will also be an agreement that you will not distribute it beyond yourself. If there is archaeological data, that will be redacted from what you receive.
Also, if you have a copy of a state survey that mentions other state surveys for your property, can you get those reports at the same time?
Yes.
Can you mention what your friend's website was again?
Okay, yeah, it's westjerseyhistory.org.
And can you go over what a manumission is, please?
Okay, manumission is basically when an enslaved individual was released from being an enslaved individual and was basically then a free person, not subject to anyone else's control. It was often done when the boat master died, or in some cases when the person had a change of heart. There are fairly few of them in New Jersey because there weren't all that many holders of enslaved people in New Jersey, but there were some, unfortunately.
What types of issues have you encountered when searching for the previous deeds of a property?
Okay, yeah. In an ideal situation, in most deeds, the deed at the end of the deed, there is a reference to the previous deed. Generally something like being the same property as was transferred by so and so to so and so, as shown in deed book. And then they give the deed book reference. I referred to that in the past as a hook, and if there is a hook, then you can go from one deed to the next. But if there is, in some cases, there is no reference to a previous deed. In that case, you generally have to look at in some cases, you can do a digitized search. You can search the digital records. In other cases, you have to go to these heavy grantor, which is seller, or grantee, which is buyer volumes, and try to track down the previous deed by looking at who you know owned the property and looking to them as a grantee to find out who they got it from. In other cases, a share sale occurred, and yet another. Generally, especially if the property has been transferred several times within the family and you've gotten back that far and there is no previous deed, I would generally tend to go to probate records and just see if there's a will for someone in the family in which the property was transferred that way. But yeah, for instance, in the book, and the report that that is included as one of the handouts, I got back to about the 1850s. I think the person who I got to was Dwight Dickinson. I don't know if he was any relation to Emily or not, both being in Amherst, Massachusetts. But in any case, I couldn't get any further back in 1973, and since the records are now online in 2024, I again looked at them, and I couldn't get any further back now.
Do you have any specific suggestions for those rural counties, Warren and Sussex? Are there any that are specifically useful in terms of resources for my corner of the state?
Okay, yeah, Warren and Sussex. Yeah, I mean, I would definitely suggest looking at agricultural censuses. I mean, I know your property may be in Belvedere, or it may be in Newton or somewhere where it's in town, but I think agricultural censuses are quite useful. I'm not sure that there are in New Jersey. And for instance, in New York, there were local agricultural publications, some of which had advertisements for farm properties. Again and again, I think newspapers, especially in the rural counties, I think newspapers would probably be even more useful because since there were fewer people there, and the news people were trying to drum up news. If you don't mind wading through a number of newspapers on microfilm, or you have some names that you want to check in a newspaper index, online newspaper digital index, I think that would be a useful way to go. Again, I've done some research in Warren and some research in Sussex, but it's been a number of years. I think that in most cases they have fairly good records at either the County Historical Society or the County Library. I would check those sources as well.
Any advice for research on a house that was part of a former company town?
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, it depends on the company, of course, but if the company some companies have archives, and archival collections. If they're company archival collections, probably the ones that are in New Jersey would be most apt to be found at either Rutgers in New Brunswick, or a few are in the State Library, and a few may be in the State Historical Society in Newark. But and then the other source of information is the Hagley Library in Wilmington, Delaware. They have a wonderful collection of industrial history. They may have some information about the property. But as far as, I think what I would basically do is try to find specific information on the company, because yeah, since it is a company town, presumably there should be information about them building the residences for the company. There may be, in some cases, that what I found for some places is that there, for instance, if you Google it, look in Google Books, there may have been something when the company town was founded, just sort of giving an information about what was being built there. As far as general information about the company, the New Jersey Industrial Directory gives a small amount of information about each company that was in a community at that point. But again, it's going to be hit and miss. With some company towns and some companies, you may be able to find an awful lot of information. Just depends whether the company felt like it was in their best interest to keep their records or not.
And can you just briefly explain what a company town is?
Okay, a company town is a community in which the yeah, for instance, one company town was a small company town, was Whitesbog in Burlington County. What it was the company built all the housing, owned all the housing. and yeah, another white place is Smithville in Burlington County as well. They owned all the housing, and in most cases, they also had a company store in which people were able to buy stuff, generally using script that was issued by the company. So it was pretty much a paternalistic sort of endeavor. In a number of cases, eventually the company town sort of broke up with the company housing being sold off to individuals when the company evolves.
How can I find out if an old building has been researched or not? This is not a home, but a small old church. Would the Historic Preservation Office have a record?
Yes, it would. With the caveat, if it has been researched on a local level in there, they may not, but that's very rare. So what I would do is basically call them up and just indicate the church that you're interested in. I should tell you that when I was there, that was one of the times that I really liked is when I picked up the phone and somebody just called up and asked about some building, because then I got to rummage in the files and figure out what I could find. Yeah, so you could definitely find out whether the Historic Preservation Office has any information by calling them up and just asking and talking to a staff member. They will gladly pull the file information. We'll usually scan it and send it to you.
Have you seen any examples of family burying grounds left off deeds over time?
Yeah. I think there have been. Yeah, actually, I'm not sure that I've seen family burying grounds left off deeds, but I found burial grounds that are not referenced in any deed that I could find. I remember I worked for 19 years for a firm called John Milner Associates, and one point one of the partners asked me to research a cemetery, and basically the only thing there were deeds for properties around it that indicated that the cemetery was there, but there were no deeds for the particular cemetery itself. So I think that is not unheard of. And yeah, I would think that, especially if it's a family burying grounds, I think it's probably more common to not have it listed in the deed than have it listed in the deed.
What is the best source to locate the history of the land prior to building a home and or community? I'm specifically speaking of subdivision land in Middlesex County prior to the 1960s.
Okay, yeah, I mean, well, what I would do first of all is just look for Middlesex County. Yeah, I would look for the subdivision plat for the particular subdivision where it is, and just look on the plat and see who the subdivider is, and then just do a chain of title back from that subdivider. Yeah, I'm not, depending on where it is in Middlesex County, I mean, you may soon run into a farm property and you can trace it back that way. And if you go back far enough, use the ag census, et cetera, as well.
Can you share the results of an interesting search you conducted on a property? What was interesting or unique about this search?
Okay. Yeah, okay. I'm just trying to think of one. Well, one that there was a property in New Hampshire. It wasn't in New Jersey. I apologize, but there was one in New Hampshire. There was a house in New Hampshire that was owned by a company. That was actually, I think it relocated from somewhere down this way. And it was used at that point as their sort of corporate public relations meeting place. I didn't know much about the property, and I started researching it back, and then I came across this man who owned it, who was further research indicated that he was a documentary filmmaker, and during his time doing further research on him, during his time there, it turned out that he did he directed and produced a film there that won an Academy Award for documentary filmmaking in that particular year. That was one of the more interesting ones. There've been a lot, but a lot of them are fairly straightforward and fairly uneventful.
I don't see any more questions right now. Let's see down here. There's a lot of accolades in the chat. Thank you so much for all the information. A little more about researching agricultural censuses, please. Where are they? What will we find, etc.?
Okay. Yeah. I can agricultural censuses basically. Yeah, the agricultural censuses that are available in the state library. There may be more recent agricultural censuses in records of the Department of Agriculture and the state archives. I'm not sure, but 19th century agricultural censuses, which were done 1850, 1860, 1870, and 1880, are available on microfilm in the microfilm room and on the fourth floor of the state library. When you put them on, the amount of information varies, but what it usually indicates is the size of the property, the name of the owner or tenant, the size of the property, the amount that has been cultivated as agricultural land, the amount that remains uncultivated, the amount of woodlots. It also includes the number of cows, or the number of animals, including cows and horses and pigs, etc. It also includes, for instance, the amount of the production in terms of dairy products and other agricultural products, including crops. It basically includes every crop that was grown on the property, the amount of acreage. So it really gives you a good cross section of what was grown on the property. If you happen to have it both an agricultural census and an insurance inventory or insurance survey, that will be excellent, because then you can not only figure out what was grown there, but what was built there as well.
And yes, all this information is in your book.
Yes, and yeah, it is available in the book. And yeah, if you're interested in it, I should just say it. The book costs $14.95. It's available from Amazon.com.
Alrighty. Anything you would like to close with?
No, I mean, I really thank all the people who came and attended this webinar. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to receiving your comments, and I hope it's been helpful for you. And please, if you have any additional comments, please just send them to my email address indicated there. And thanks very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Douglas, for a fantastic presentation. And thank you everybody for attending today. Please be on the lookout for the follow-up email that'll include the handouts as well, in case you were unable to download them. So, and on this snowy, rainy day, I'd just like to tell everybody, be safe, be well, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Andrew.